Welcome, everybody. We're just gonna give ourselves a minute here and let everybody log on. If anyone else is having the days I'm sure that Neil and I are having, or just running from a call to another call, and we're very grateful you take the time to be here with us today. Of course, we're going to be having a discussion on everyone's favorite topic du jour, the SEC's climate disclosure ruling and its implications for businesses and firms. I want to go ahead and get us started and kicked off here. So give yourself a second to get settled. I'm gonna dive right in. So allow me to introduce myself to start. I'm Corinne Hansen. I'm the VP of Sustainability here at Greenplaces. I'm thrilled to be moderating the session alongside Neil Popović, a partner in ESG at the sustainability team leader at Sheppard Mullin. As we kick off today's webinar, I just want to take a moment to connect with one another in the chat. Feel free to go ahead and just drop your name, your company, and one or two sustainability initiatives that you are working on at the moment, what's top of mind, something that you're planning and working on implementing. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you on with me today. I wonder if you would maybe take a second and take a stab at the question I just posed about what you're working on and what's top of mind for you today.
Sure. So thank you, first of all, for allowing me to be a part of this. And, ESG and the SEC climate rules and the California rules and the European Union, CSRD, all this stuff is swirling around a lot of our practice areas. And a lot of what I do at my firm is kind of issue spotting and talent spotting within the firm. And so some of the big challenges now that we're facing are a client comes with a question and where does it go? What's the expertise that's needed? Is it a securities lawyer? Is it somebody who's not a lawyer, somebody like Greenplaces? And kind of helping folks navigate that is really what's occupying a lot of our attention now. And knowing that it's all uncertain, things are changing every day, and how you keep up with that. So that's what's on our minds.
I'm sure that is echoed by a lot of folks. I know that we get questions every day that I would love to have a talk track for, but the truth of the matter is you really have to stay abreast, and it's hard to do. So happy to be here today, especially in light of some recent updates. But I just want to start, and maybe before we dive into our session, just give a quick overview of what we'll cover. To that point of staying abreast of recent developments, I'm sure many of you are aware the SEC's climate disclosure ruling, which was finalized on March 6th, 2024 this year, will require publicly traded companies in the US to report on their emissions. However, there have been numerous recent legal challenges, both for and against the ruling as it stands, and asking for it to be strengthened even further. It's led to a pause in implementation, which creates a dynamic and evolving landscape for businesses to navigate. Our agenda today is designed to equip you with the insights and strategies that you need not only to comply with the ruling, but also to leverage it for strategic advantage. We'll definitely talk about the relevance of the stay and what that means for you as a company, but we want to dive in definitely to the ruling overall. So today we'll cover the key facts and requirements of the SEC's climate disclosure ruling, why this matters right now, even in light of the stay, and despite ongoing legal challenges, what you need to know to do and stay ahead of the curve, how Greenplaces can support your journey, of course, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions, because while we've tried to anticipate the things that you are worried about, I find I gather my greatest insights when talking with clients, when talking with partners, and figuring out what is concerning businesses at hand. Also, this session is being recorded, so if you have colleagues, partners that you want to share this with, you want to disseminate, please feel free to do so. We'll email the recording out tomorrow. So I just want to start with a little poll. We'll take a moment to gauge where everyone stands in their emissions reporting journey, always evolving. And so the poll should have popped up for everyone now. Do you currently collect any data or report on any of your emissions? So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, scopes 1 and 2, none. Or are you unsure, you're not really the one running this piece and you're just trying to get informed? Let's see. I'm also going to open up our chat. Lovely to see some familiar faces on here. Excellent. Okay, so scopes 1 and 2 pretty popular, but beating out the rest is none, which is exceptionally common. I think that is part of the reason a lot of folks are joining a webinar like this today, or trying to get up to speed on what exactly is required. So you come to the right place. Of course, your scope 1 and 2 emissions are a critical part of this role, but also your scope 3 emissions are really critical to understanding your own business and also to other requirements and regulations we'll touch on briefly, just sort of the context of the ruling in the wider regulatory framework. So thanks everybody for sharing that. So I want to start a little bit with maybe things on the more boring side of the lens here. Quick glossary. So as we navigate the SEC ruling, it's essential to establish some common language. I wouldn't slight any of you for not having poured through the 900-page document itself, but a couple of things that are going to come up over and over and over again that you're going to want to understand that pertain to disclosure. The first of which is an attestation report. Think of that as a third-party verification of a company's reported greenhouse gas emissions, ensuring accuracy and reliability of the data itself. Really common questions around the difference between limited assurance and reasonable assurance. These terms refer to the level of scrutiny that is applied by a third-party verifier, with reasonable assurance being a more thorough and in-depth review compared to a limited assurance, and certainly different levels of time intensity, costs, etc. Certainly something we can help you navigate. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, of course, is the global standard for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions. It provides a consistent framework for companies to follow. It's the preeminent guidance. It's the basis for which BSI's ISO certification was founded. So it really gives you not only the what, but also the why and the how of greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting. And lastly, TCFD recommendations now under ISSB. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures offers guidelines for companies to effectively communicate the financial impact of climate change on their business. So when you see in the SEC disclosures reference to risk, financial risk, climate risk, and the interrelationship between the two, these are all based very, very heavily on the TCFD recommendations. So understanding these terms are going to help you better grasp the requirements in the SEC ruling, which we're going to dive into now. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Neil to walk you through the facts and requirements of the SEC's climate disclosure rules. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Corinne, for setting stage. So what are we talking about here? On March 6th of this year, the SEC finalized a long and extended multiple time process of rulemaking to promulgate its historic climate disclosure rules. And those rules, in very broad strokes, require public companies to disclose their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as well as, and in doing so, there are attestation requirements, and also the material impacts of climate change on their business, so what climate risk they face, and how they are managing that climate risk. And this applies to all domestic and foreign registrants. There are different timelines for different kinds of filers, and they all will require some form of reporting phased in over time. And they are also, quite importantly, scaled back from the initial proposed SEC rules, which would have included scope 3 emissions for some registrants. And then perhaps most importantly, although the rules were promulgated March 6th, it didn't take very long. In fact, the next day they were challenged in court. And it didn't take much longer than that for the SEC itself on April 4 to issue a stay of implementation. So that means, according to the SEC, they are not in place, but critically important here is that the timelines, they haven't changed the timeline. So although they're suspended right now, if and when they kick back in, the timelines haven't changed. They might in the future, but they haven't yet. So that's where we're starting from. And what are you going to have to do? The SEC rules focus on a number of things, 3 primary things. One is the reporting of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 1 emissions, as you probably know, are the emissions that an entity generates in its own operations. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are tied to purchased energy. So if your operations, you're in a building, you're doing whatever it is you do as a service provider, as a manufacturer, whatever it might be, you purchase energy from somewhere, and that energy generates greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the 2 primary forms of emissions that will need to be tracked and reported under the SEC rules. As I noted, Scope 3, not yet. Scope 3 was of great concern. Scope 3 is up and down the value chain. Everything that contributes to or that you contribute to in terms of emissions. Scope 3 is off the table in terms of the SEC rules for now, but as Corinne mentioned, there are other sets of rules, state rules, particularly in California and coming along in New York, and also rules outside the United States that will require Scope 3 reporting. And there's also a provision where if a company has targets that include Scope 3 that are publicly announced, then they may have to report on those and how they're complying with those targets. Other elements of the rule include climate-related financial impacts, again with the materiality standard, and that includes things like severe weather impacts, what's sometimes referred to as transition risks, so decarbonization efforts or regulatory expenses that a company will have to address in order to bring itself into compliance with other rules. There's also the third component here is detailed disclosures about how companies assess and manage their climate-related risks. And that includes at the board level and at the management level. So who on the board has oversight? What is the process for exercising that oversight? And then who in management is responsible for ESG and climate considerations? Thanks, Corinne.
Thank you, Neil. So I think the question on everyone's minds is why now and why does this matter right now? So I want to just like +1 on your comments around why this is still relevant even with the stay. While the timeline for compliance remains a bit uncertain due to the ongoing legal challenges, companies can gain a significant strategic advantage by starting their preparations early. These are things that take a significant amount of time, and it's operating within a wider context, right? Disclosures are required legally in local jurisdictions, international jurisdictions with varying timelines and complexity. But also this is stakeholder demanded. This is something that is tied very closely to financial risk and understanding the risk associated with companies and their ability to operate. Also, climate change is expensive business. So it really is within the fiduciary responsibility realm of any company operating to understand the entire scope of what the impact of climate change is on their business. So if you take that investor lens, it really makes it plain why this is critical right now. A couple things I want to flag is that building a corporate culture around sustainability reporting takes time. It requires a deep understanding of the implications for your business. Proactive preparation allows you to stay ahead of the curve, and the demand for climate disclosure is driven by stakeholders as much as those legal mandates, as I mentioned. So that's the kind of thing that is going to require you to generate governance structure internally, get buy-in internally, understand the systems that you need to implement to gather data appropriately. That brings me to my next point, which is that collecting data for reporting on just scopes 1 and 2 emissions and identifying material climate risks is itself really, really time consuming. It's not to be underestimated. Even though there are frameworks available, resources, et cetera, it's something that we definitely guide clients through multi-month processes on. Data collection alone can take a month if you're really, really organized. It can take 6 months if you're less organized, and it's definitely gone longer for us with the number of clients in their first years as they try to navigate their own complex internal landscapes. And so it requires significant effort and resources, even for companies who've already started their carbon accounting. So by starting now, you can position your company as a leader in sustainability and attract investors who prioritize ESG factors. It's not something that you want to be 12 months down the road going, oh no, we need to report now. How do we collect this? It'll already be too late. So the SEC's climate disclosure rule has several significant implications. For public companies and particularly for smaller organizations that may not have had the extensive resources available to public companies of their larger counterparts. For companies eyeing an IPO especially, early adoption of climate disclosure practices is really attractive for investors and can offer a strategic advantage. By integrating those reporting practices ahead of time, companies can ensure smoother transitions along the IPO process, align with investor expectations, and position themselves as sustainability leaders. The rules enhance investor transparency for sure, allowing them to more accurately gauge a company's exposure to climate risks. consider those factors when making investment decisions. The entire intent of this process from the SEC, and the chair will tell you over and over and over again in all of the speeches, is investor focused, right? We want to make sure that we're adhering to the requirements to disclose appropriately for companies, their financial data, and that does include ESG data now. For companies or firms who already work with clients like Microsoft, Apple, Walmart, they already know they're multiple years into the process of what essentially is a voluntary disclosure framework that requires very similar disclosure data. So understanding risks and certainly your emissions, what you're doing about it, mitigation strategies, your organizational structure, all of those are parts of their voluntary disclosure and are necessary to continue to work with those companies. There are a few more reasons here on the screen, but for the sake of time, I want to keep ticking us forward. And of course, I want to think about, and all of our clients are asking us, how this ruling might apply to different industries and to your business. And so retailers practically need to think about how to assess climate risk associated with supply chains. This is something that they're already navigating. We just want to put it in the framing of ESG. Energy companies will need to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and outline their strategies for transitioning to a low carbon economy. This is critical. And financial institutions will need to evaluate the climate risks in their investment portfolios and develop disclosure frameworks for their clients. This is one of those interesting positions where you see necessity for climate disclosure on either end, right? The companies that are being invested in want to understand how to improve, how to make themselves more attractive, and the financial institutions themselves want to understand how to navigate risk in the marketplace. It is also, I think we've noted already previously, I want to dive into this a little bit. It's important to note that the SEC's rules are part of a broader global movement toward increased climate transparency. All of this, of course, investor and stakeholder driven. But these regulations, this rule aligns with similar legislative actions in California and the EU, further emphasizes the growing importance of climate-related disclosures in investment decision-making and corporate governance alike. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Directive, CSRD, as you all I'm sure are aware, was introduced in 2023. It brings a really rigorous framework to sustainability reporting, compels US companies who operate in the EU to adhere to those standards as well. It's quite rigorous. Meanwhile, California's SB 253 and 261, which have sort of broken up Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosure and climate risk disclosure under those two separate acts and require a wide range of companies to report on Scope 1, 2, and even Scope 3 emissions, plus climate risks. About 50,000 companies have been impacted by CSRD and about 5,000 by SB 253 and 261. And then, of course, there's additional rules in the offing. So we've seen in New York, S897A is making its way through the state Senate at the moment. So there's a proposal there. As the regulatory environment continues to evolve, businesses have to stay informed, adapt their disclosure strategies accordingly. We understand that this continues to be increasingly complex. So, of course, that's why we've brought you all here today. Okay, now that we've given you a lot of context, I definitely want to dive into the meat of today's content. So let's start with an overview of the requirements themselves. And in the chat, as we go through this list, I'd be really curious to hear if anyone on the line is already tackling these requirements to fulfill state or EU regulations, or for other reasons. You're working within a voluntary framework, you've got a supplier request, an RFP to meet. So feel free to go ahead and drop that there. So the first of which is material climate-related risks disclosure. Organizations are required to disclose climate-related risks that have materially impacted or are likely to impact the company's business strategy, results of an operation, or financial condition. This includes short-term and long-term impacts. The one thing I want to say about this is that this conversation around materiality and material risks is a really wide and varied one. There are more strict definitions regionally on what's material financially to companies. That's something that I'm sure your firms or businesses have all navigated previously. The conversation around what is a material risk in the ESG space hasn't been as clearly defined. This is definitely one of the most foundational and fundamental critiques of the SEC's ruling and all other rulings on ESG disclosure. And it's probably one of the more complex pieces that need to be navigated. This is one of the reasons that a cross-functional team is so essential to figuring out how to disclose appropriately. You really aren't going to be able to determine what is material in this sense, material risk, without involving your investor relations teams, your ops teams, your legal teams, and so on. So this is something we get lots of questions about. Next is impacts on strategy, business model, and outlook. Organizations are already required to disclose actual and potential material impacts of identified climate risks on the company's strategy, business model, and outlook. Third is transition plan. If a transition plan is adopted to manage material transition risks, that needs to be disclosed. Organizations have to describe that and provide annual updates or actions taken under that plan and the impact. Fourth is governance. Organizations must also describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and management role in assessing and managing these risks. As I stated previously, this takes time to organize. Fifth is risk management. Organizations must describe processes for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks. And then, of course, targets and goals. So disclosing any climate-related targets, goals, including metrics, KPIs for tracking progress, and any reliance on carbon offsets or renewable energy credits. And one thing I'll note about what's on the screen now is that in here I haven't even touched on the emissions themselves. And so that should highlight the focus within the SEC's disclosure on risk, and really that being a paramount component that folks want to understand, that investors want to see and understand about companies going forward. On the topic of greenhouse gas emissions disclosure, though, organizations have to disclose their scope 1 and 2 emissions when material. Again, you'll see this term come up, along with the attestation report covering the disclosure of these emissions. They also must disclose financial statement effects. So the financial statement effects of severe weather events and other natural conditions, including costs and losses. And so what you see here is really an integration of financial risk and climate risk all in one disclosure cycle. So I'll just sort of pause this there. I want to take another moment to gauge the room. How do you perceive the impact of SEC's climate disclosure ruling on your organization? So we popped another poll up here. Would you say A, highly positive? This is great. We're thrilled to see it. Aligns with our sustainability goals. So somewhat positive. It's an opportunity for improvement, but we do overall think that this is a good thing. Are you neutral? It's just another compliance requirement. I would say that language of neutral maybe doesn't feel so true to folks who see it as another compliance requirement. Concerned or really unsure about implication and cost. We're not sure how to navigate this, or is this not relevant to you? We file outside of the scope, but we're just kind of curious to see what partners, suppliers, vendors, etc. And feel free to drop any additional comments into the chat. Great, I'm actually thrilled to see this. Highly positive, somewhat positive. I think that if I were to guess, I would have to attribute that to the fact that most organizations have already been working on this and feel like it's an opportunity to show that this hard work, and truly it is hard work, is not for naught, that you're seeing pressure externally and internally to disclose the things that you're already trying to be accountable to as a business. So with that background, I want to hand it back over to Neil to walk us through the roles and timelines for every filer.
Thank you, Corinne. First, who is immediately impacted by these rules? They do apply only to public companies, and I'm just going to make a note here. That's not the case for California. California's rules apply to private companies as well. And so, although we're focused here on the SEC rules, that doesn't mean those are the only things you need to worry about, as Corinne mentioned. So it primarily affects public companies that are registered with the SEC and requires them to disclose specific climate-related information in their filings. And that starts with large accelerated filers and accelerated filers. They may have additional requirements, including the need to file attestation reports. And I would say the bigger the company, the more aggressive, both in terms of level of attestation and in terms of the timeline. And, and those attestation reports go to the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions reporting. And as Corinne mentioned, that's something that many companies don't yet know how to do, so they need to learn how to do it. They may need help learning how to do it, and they need to make sure they get it right. The ruling does, or the rule rather, it does exempt small reporting and emerging growth companies from some of the requirements, such as Scope 1 and Scope 2. It does not exempt them from everything. And one can also expect that it's a matter of time before Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions may be something that they have to report. And also their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions may be relevant to someone else's reporting, and so they still may need to keep track of it. Foreign companies that are not registered under U.S. federal securities laws, but are making disclosures under the TCFD framework and or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they might be indirectly affected. And again, it's important to think of the other companies that your company does business with. So for example, you may not have to worry about reporting yourself or thinking about Scope 3 emissions, but you may be a California company, part of a California company's Scope 3 emissions, so you need to keep track of your own Scope 1 and Scope 2 so they can report it. So there is issued by the SEC a nice handy table that we've adapted here that tells you when things kick in. All of this with the big caveat that because of the legal challenges, and again, those come from both sides, that is, industry has challenged the rules as overstepping the regulatory authority of the SEC, and environmental organizations and others have challenged the rules as not going far enough, for example, by not including Scope 3 emissions. So all of that is uncertain. That makes it uncertain as to when things will actually kick in. But assuming they do kick in, right now, the timelines that the SEC has put in place would put them into effect starting in 2026, going back to fiscal year 2025. And again, it will be phased in terms of the level of attestation and which kinds of companies have to report at what time. It is conceivable that the SEC rule will be approved, the rules will be approved by the courts, and I guess the most challenging scenario would be they get approved and the timelines are not changed. And then companies are going to have to very quickly scramble. So for example, large accelerated filers will need to be ready to file with respect to 2025 in 2026 to include disclosures and financial statement effects of climate risk, and they will have to get ready the next year to report their greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then it drops back a year for accelerated filers, and then another year for the small registered companies and emerging growth companies. Go to the next one. So for large accelerated filers, and actually let me just pause for a moment here. The SEC climate disclosure rules don't create new definitions or new categories of the different kinds of filers. So companies that are large accelerated filers for other purposes or accelerated filers for other purposes will be that for climate disclosure rule purposes as well. So for the large accelerated filers, the SEC rule requires that they disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions along with filing attestation reports. And the attestation report with limited assurances starts from the third fiscal year after their compliance date, and then it shifts to reasonable assurance, which is a higher standard, starting from the seventh fiscal year. And for all of this, it's crucial that large accelerated filers understand these requirements and start preparing the data collection and the reporting processes right away. It's not something that you can just flip a switch and assimilate, gather the data. Sometimes it's not clear where to find it or how to measure it, how to track it, how to consolidate it. And so the more of a head start you get, the better. And for accelerated filers, they will also be required to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions under the SEC rule, along with attestation reports, but on a slower and less stringent timeline. So they are only required to file an attestation report with limited assurance starting from the third fiscal year after the compliance date. And the distinctions in assurance levels between large accelerated filers and accelerated filers highlights the SEC's efforts to balance the burdens of compliance with the need for reliable disclosures. And this was a big topic among the comments. There were, by the way, historic numbers of comments that were provided to the SEC, which is part of the reason it took so long for them to promulgate the rules. But there was quite a lot of pushback about how expensive it would be to comply and how that could be crippling to some smaller companies in particular. And the final rules address and acknowledge, and I think accommodate to a great extent, those concerns. And then with respect to small reporting companies and emerging growth companies that are currently exempt from some of the requirements. They will not have to report their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but they will have to report material impacts or material climate risk, and material in the sense that it will have a material impact on their financial performance. So what does that mean for small reporting companies? They cannot ignore the SEC rules. They need to anticipate what's coming. They need to appeal to the markets that they serve, and they need to get ready to for what is demanded by their business partners, what will be demanded by the regulatory authorities, and how they are going to stay ahead of the curve here. So they need to familiarize themselves with scope 1 and scope 2 reporting, so that as they are required to report, or if they become part of someone else's scope 3 reporting under the California rules, for example, they can provide that information. They can provide it in a reliable way and a timely way. There's also some benefit to engaging early with climate disclosure practices. It enhances the attractiveness of a company that's seeking to be acquired. It makes it easier for someone to acquire you. And there certainly are some companies that are looking for targets that are easy to fix. So they might not require perfect adherence, but to show that you've considered it, you're ready to comply, can be hugely attractive. It also can give you a competitive edge in the marketplace by showing that you are aware of best practices in sustainability. You are able to speak the language. You can engage with ESG requirements. It creates a culture both in terms of attracting business, attracting employees, and learning what's going on, so you are ready for the next step in the rapidly and ever-changing landscape. So as we evaluate and navigate this evolving landscape of the SEC's climate disclosure requirements, there are some things, again, that companies can do, even if the actual reporting obligations seem to be far off in the future. Initiating data collection is critical to identify your direct emissions so that you can report scope 1, to understand and then identify where you purchase your energy so that you can report on scope 2. These things, as Corinne mentioned, it takes time to figure out where to find the data, how to gather it, how to analyze it, how to understand it. And often it will require assistance from someone else. You might not have the data yourself, or you might not have access to the data. So you may need a consultant like Greenplaces to help you understand it, but you may also need to talk to your landlord, for example, to get some of the information that you don't necessarily have. You also need to evaluate your governance frameworks. That reporting is very important, and it's not going to be good enough to say we're thinking about it or that we have a plan in the future. You need to understand how your company regulates, manages, and addresses climate risks, both in terms of keeping track of your carbon footprint and in terms of how you are going to address, plan for, and discuss climate risk, and ultimately who has responsibility for managing that at both the board level and the management level. And that means having clear lines of reporting, clear roles and responsibilities at the board level. Sometimes that means creating an ESG committee. Sometimes it means assigning it to the audit committee or to the governance committee. It will be very company specific, but whatever the specifics are, it needs to be assigned to someone, both at the board level and at the management level. It's also critically important to monitor what's going on with the SEC. and the other potentially relevant regulatory bodies, whether it's the EU or a US state such as California or New York, because they are changing things all the time. California's rules are coming into force, but there still are regulations that need to be promulgated there by the California Air Resources Board. The SEC rules are likely to change in some way as a result of the legal challenges, but we don't know which way. And so staying on top of this and kind of being ready for what might happen in the future, being ready to pivot quickly, is very important. And the more information you have, the more familiar you are with your own carbon footprint, your own governance structure, the more readily you can adapt to that changing landscape.
That's excellent, Neil. Thank you so much for walking us through that. I think two additional things I kind of want to call out here are that, and I'm curious if you agree, with the CSRD requirements, as with the California requirements, what you see in terms of the division across large accelerated filers, et cetera, who's impacted by this, and the timelines, typically what you see is like a build, but that you're all kind of building toward the same disclosure requirements. So what's different about the SEC is that you are seeing different requirements, either just to focus on risk or just to focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions, phased slightly differently for large companies and small filers. So that's definitely a change. And then the degree of uncertainty, right? We've got many more pages of requirements and disclosures for CSRD, and pretty clear requirements for California, but there's still a fair amount of uncertainty in terms of timing with the SEC. So it's a lot to parse. So I'm curious if you agree with me about the approach of you've got to really cast a wide net with your internal stakeholders, get everyone involved now to make sure that you have your arms around this, even just understanding which kind of filer you are, what's already happening in terms of your audit and management space internally, and then what does your governance structure currently look like so that you can build into that.
I completely agree. And one example of that is, you may have operations in multiple jurisdictions that each have their local requirements, but because you are operating in those multiple jurisdictions, you have to report according to another jurisdiction's requirements. And there may be different thresholds of materiality. There may be different timelines, and understanding you don't want to fail to collect data because it's not relevant locally when you may still have to report it as part of your international operations. Or, for example, in California, there are different financial thresholds in terms of your overall business. But if you do any business in California, you have to report in California. So it's not enough to say that's just a small part of our business. One of the interesting things to watch will be the extent to which there's harmonization, so that companies are spared the need to report against a bunch of different standards, and also whether companies may decide that they just report to the highest standard because that's the most efficient way to do it, rather than to have multiple different sets. So it's going to be, there are a lot of efforts, I would say, in the background to try and harmonize the requirements to some extent, but that's going to be very hard to accomplish because you have different stakeholders in California or New York or federally, and certainly in Europe.
Yeah, that's a good point, that this uncertainty is actually going to cause a race to the top in some ways. We'll have to make sure we're hitting the highest requirement. And I chuckled a little bit at your mention of speaking with your landlords, because I think that is a thing that I can speak to from working with Greenplaces and working at Greenplaces, is that our mission is really we're here to support businesses and help them deliver more accurate carbon footprint in less time with less effort. It's historically been a consulting exercise or something that's done internally with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of confusion. So we understand that the process is really complicated. Collecting, analyzing, reporting emissions data is time consuming, resource intensive. There's a lot to navigate in the greenhouse gas protocol alone in terms of methodology variances. When you don't have data, what methodology to use, what other emissions factors, proxies can be applied. So we've designed our platform to streamline that task. We're agnostic about the type of data that you provide to us. We take on a lot of that responsibility of parsing that data internally and deliver meaningful change and the opportunity to build a more sustainable future for your business through those insights. So with Greenplaces, you can have confidence in the accuracy and reliability of your sustainability data, which, as we've just covered, is so critical for the next several years of disclosure requirements. with also the benefit and ease of using our platform. We understand that the complexities and challenges that come with navigating the SEC's climate disclosure ruling are vast, and that's why we've developed an all-in-one platform to help streamline your journey. We offer data collection for greenhouse gas emissions, expert insights, and personalized reduction strategies. Interestingly, not something that is specifically required by most of these reporting frameworks, but certainly is required of all voluntary reporting frameworks. And as we've seen, all of these rulings have taken a page from pre-existing voluntary frameworks like TCFD, now ISSB, now built into the SEC ruling, for instance. We also provide support for those voluntary frameworks, CDP, EcoVadis, SPTI, et cetera, and access to an extensive ESG policy template library. So when you see requirements around governance structure, policies, et cetera, a lot of that is really difficult to navigate internally. Ours have been vetted by a team of attorneys. So you can simplify that process for meeting the SEC's requirements while unlocking strategic benefits of sustainability for your business. And with us, you know that you're working with extensive experience in the sustainability reporting, deep knowledge of carbon accounting standards, internationally and domestically, and active involvement in leading sustainability organizations. So what could be a full-time job of just keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sustainability field, our team is doing that work behind the scenes all day, every day, to make sure that we can bring leading insights, that we are within regulatory compliance, and navigating a nascent and constantly shifting field, which is sustainability. So our team is really committed to providing you with the most accurate and reliable data, insights, and guidance to support your sustainability journey, which I hope we've been able to accomplish on this webinar today. You know, there's a lot of material to cover and a lot more still to cover in wider context, but I'll just kind of pause this there. I'm happy to turn over to the chat and also to answer any questions that might come up now. Neil and I are certainly happy to tag team those. But thank you all so much for being here with us today. I want to open the floor now to submit your questions to the Q&A feature. If we don't get to your question today, we'll be following up with you after the session. So let me go ahead and just pop that open.
And as you do that, let me just make one quick comment, that part of the value of having this discussion is to learn about best practices. This is broadly speaking, a risk management issue for most companies, and figuring out how to invest in it smartly, so that you don't make false steps. You get the benefit of learning from others who have thought about it already. And also, as Corinne mentioned earlier, so that gets kind of socialized within your organization. So it's not seen as something new and scary, but rather understood as an important fundamental part of how you do business. And then it becomes easier to get buy-in by the people who need to buy into it within an organization.
Thanks, Neil. Forgive me, I'm navigating the chat, which seems to have disappeared, and I want to get the Q&A tool open. Okay, I think I've got it open. It might be that we've got some shy folks say about asking questions, or that you're having similar technical difficulty in seeing that pop up. But if you cannot, feel free to drop them directly into the chat itself. So for Michael McGinn, to add to Neil's point on risk management, D&O insurers are all over this. Yeah, Neil, I don't know if you want to expand on that anymore.
Yeah, they are. It's interesting how they are all over it too, because they were, if you go back to the early days of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the first industry groups to participate in the Conference of the Parties were insurance companies. But then if you look at what happened in response to the SEC proposed climate rules, the insurance companies submitted some rather strong comments asking them to be scaled back. So they are acutely aware of kind of enterprise risk and potentially D&O risk that goes along with these issues.
Yeah, there's always that push-pull, isn't there? Nothing's ever simple. Another question, what are the steps I should take to start exploring a conversation internally around reporting and disclosure? So there's a couple of different ways. I think the Harvard Business Review actually does a really nice log of different ways that sustainability involves internally at companies. So I'd encourage you to check that out. But I'll just speak to it a little bit here in that organizations can evolve their sustainability strategies in sort of like two directions. One from the top down, where you've got CEO buy-in, engagement, and governance structure and team that's focused on sustainability and kind of hands down operationalization of those objectives, KPIs, goals, and overall strategy. Historically, you saw a lot of grassroots movements around sustainability. Basically, you had passionate individuals, especially young people, coming into business and saying, see a lot of opportunity for impact here. If I were to make one small change in our supply chain, it could have a vast impact versus what I'm able to accomplish individually on my own. I'm sure that's a pretty common tale for a lot of you on the line here. But I do think that the field has changed and that you need that top-down engagement. And so even if you've got a motivated group of individuals, maybe you're not responding to compliance and regulation, you're really just responding to more interest from stakeholders internally and externally. I think you still need to start by getting a roundtable of leaders across the organization into a room, starting a conversation maybe around the landscape and sustainability, these regulations, requirements, what applies to you, what doesn't, and what you're seeing in terms of leadership across the board, benchmarking, who are your competitors, what are they doing, what are their KPIs and frameworks and targets, as well as what are their strategies, what pages can we rip out of their books and learn from. And so that would be my recommendation, is to get everyone into a room and to start to talk about that and get some material in front of folks to react to. From Zachary Berliner, we've got how should companies evaluate materiality of their GHG emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, to decide if they should be reported under the SEC rules. The SEC rules don't give a lot of guidance on it, other than an example of reporting emissions are key to gauging performance against goals, targets for cutting emissions. What a fair critique of the SEC's ruling and of any other requirement around materiality to date. So a little bit of history here too. I'll say I've done dozens of materiality assessments in my career in sustainability. When I was working on the Hill in my early career, it was a conversation that came up a lot around just like what can be reasonably expected for companies to understand. And I think I mentioned that on the financial side, there is not a ton of higher order alignment on what's material, but there's a lot of jurisdictionally relevant definitions of what's material. So I think that what we can expect is that that's coming. That's definitely been a huge pressure on the SEC is to provide clearer guidance. Without it, we need to rely on frameworks like what was formerly TCFD, now ISSB, GRI, SASB, and the a sort of a lighter version in the SEC's case of a materiality assessment. But you're going to need to consider a wider range of stakeholders to weigh in on that conversation. So an internal and external stakeholder exercise to rank and prioritize issues, to take a look at actual climate impacts, both in sort of like their relationship to market and their relationship to physical climate risks, as the TCFD lays out. There's really sort of those two buckets of risks to consider, and then winnow those down of what applies to your company. I think probably what you'll see is in the first year, 2 years, 3 years of reporting, some leniency afforded to companies that choose to omit certain risks. And then, as the whole name of the game is transparency and disclosure, additional pressure from investors, especially, to say, you didn't include XYZ risk, which is on its face material to you as a company. We really want to see it. We want to see your governance structure. We want to see KPIs around mitigation. We want to see action plans. So maybe a long-winded answer of saying we don't have clear guidance, and that's such a fair critique. We should expect it. And I think we should sort of prepare to cast that wide net until we do have more guidance.
Yeah. If I could just quickly add to that, I think there's also a process component there, which goes to how you're determining it. Are you gathering the information and you have a process to determine whether something is material is going to be important? Whereas a company that just is dismissive or doesn't gather the information in the first place and then try to determine whether it's material, I think is going to run into more problems.
That's a good point, Neil. Whether or not your process is harmonized across industry is maybe less relevant than whether or not you can establish that you have a process and you can justify it. Last question here. What is your advice for companies with a remote workforce and mostly digital operations? What's the best way to think through our climate impact when there's a lack of physical assets that directly generate emissions? This is a question we get with a lot of our clients, that I think there was a pandemic-driven move toward remote work that was already, or maybe a hastening rather, was already in place, as well as an interest from a lot of stakeholders to see that happen because they're expending a lot of resources transitioning employees between offices, across offices, traveling to meetings, that a lot of that can be accomplished on Zoom as we are here today. And so what do you do about that? If you're already reducing your footprint, so to say, by taking these measures that are now aligned with common business practice, what realistically can we do? I'll reference our like policy library that I mentioned earlier. There's a couple of baseline steps that you can make sure you have in place. I think having clear systems to disclose and the rationale for those, to Neil's previous point, just showing that you've thought this through and that you have actively participated in establishing policies rather than we're already doing everything we can. There's not much more for us to say, is going to be really critical for the disclosure side of things. And then that employee engagement side, if you're talking about practical application, is really critical. And frankly, another way that remote employees can feel a part of your overall sustainability mission. So are there measures that you can implement in terms of their home office setups? What guidance can you provide them around decarbonizing their own spaces? That's like a very useful strategy for additional employee engagement. And then we often get this question from companies who know that they're doing a lot in terms of their typical structure, employee commute, et cetera, but maybe are still pretty nascent in their overall understanding of their total greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say we have had 0 cases where we haven't been able to identify a decarbonization strategy, even in the case of high remote work participation. And digital ops. Even if you've got one office, one location, maybe you just work with WeWorks. There's ways to not only track your emissions and use proxies wherever possible, but engage your suppliers, understand your emissions, understand opportunities. And so I would say that you still want to start with, for the purposes of disclosure and also for understanding how you can decarbonize, measuring those emissions, and then go from there armed with that information. Yeah, I'm curious if you have anything you want to add to that one.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's perhaps a subset of a broader issue about, for example, professional services firms thinking we don't really have a carbon footprint. We're just doing stuff for other people. Well, everything we do has a carbon footprint. This webinar has a carbon footprint. Bitcoin mining has a massive carbon footprint. So there are a lot of things. I think a lot of this is changing the way people think about what their emissions, what their contributions to emissions might be, even if they are indirect. And again, you may need to rely more than you would in other contexts on third parties to help you understand that and gather the relevant information and process the relevant information. But it's there, and we can't defy the laws of physics. The energy is being generated, and it is producing greenhouse gas emissions. And we just need to get smarter about understanding, socializing with people, what their impact is. If you sit at your computer all day at home, you still have an impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and scope 2. It just might be a little harder to figure it out.
That's right. And I'll also just say, sort of like on an optimistic tone, if you don't have the perfect answer right now, it doesn't mean it's not coming. And part of this exercise of transparency means that there will be a larger volume of data available in the public sphere. And that's a catalyst for action. Understanding the scale of emissions and seeing it reduce because a company has disclosed not only their targets, but their activities and how their mitigation plans is going to enable lots of other companies to follow suit. So no one's expected to figure every single piece out independently, but if we're all kind of working in parallel on addressing the same problem, it should expedite the process of decarbonization. And so while I know the SEC is relatively well bounded in its jurisdiction and its expectations, it's agnostic, it says about climate over and over and over again, but obviously is not agnostic about what it requires just on disclosure for the sake of investors making fiduciary decisions. The rest of us are not agnostic about climate, right? Like we are doing this for a purpose. It's that climate change is a real material physical risk to all of us, to our businesses, to our prosperity, and to the planet. And so while we can get bogged down, I think, in what do we have to disclose? What are the mechanics of the day? We are feeding into a much wider picture. And I think that's really important to keep sight of.
And I would say the fact that we're even talking about it is a huge step. So this is, to consider the relationship between the economic goals and incentives that companies address and their impact on the environment, the community, and their corporate integrity it's a game-changing way to think about how you operate a business. And this is part of it. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it is important.
Absolutely. Well, Neil, thank you so much again for taking the time, not only to prepare remarks and speak with me about this. I really enjoyed our chats on the back end of this, but for, of course, presenting today and walking everyone through this historic moment, if not completely unprecedented, certainly in a wider context, but pretty difficult to parse. So I'm very grateful for you being here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be involved.
Thanks, everybody, so much. We are grateful to you all for being here as well. If you do have questions, of course, feel free to reach out. We'll make sure we send out the recording and the slides themselves so you can walk through with colleagues, partners, and we are always willing, excited to keep this conversation going. So thanks all, and we'll be in touch.